At 2:15 in the morning, I walked into my house and caught my son-in-law and an unfamiliar woman inside my private study. He was standing right in front of my computer, and she said, "Try the password 1612." It wasn't until I spoke up softly that they even realized I was in the room. I said, "I made it back earlier than expected." I didn't press them with questions, and I didn't start a confrontation right then and there. I simply turned around and walked toward the kitchen. But that exact moment was when everything began to unravel. "I really appreciate you spending time with me right now. Before we dive deeper, leave a comment below to let me know where you are watching from today, your city or country. Knowing where you are tuning in from means more to me than you might think. This narrative includes fictional elements created for storytelling and reflection. Any resemblance to real persons or places is purely coincidental, but the underlying lesson is one worth holding on to. On a clear night, the drive back from Indianapolis usually takes about 4 hours. I made it in 3 hours and 50 minutes, stopping only once for a quick cup of coffee at a gas station just past the state line, my mind completely blank. Looking back, that was my very first mistake. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, a scheduled supplier meeting had been canceled via email due to a sudden scheduling conflict on their end, nothing out of the ordinary. I packed up my overnight bag, settled the hotel bill, and hit the road home without calling ahead. When I turned onto Ridgemont Avenue, it was just past 2 in the morning. The neighborhood was dead dark. Every porch light was off, every window pitch black. My house sat right at the end of the cul-de-sac, completely quiet, looking exactly as it had when I left 4 days earlier. Before pulling into the driveway, I switched off my headlights. It was an old habit built over decades of late arrivals, a simple way to avoid flashing light through the bedroom windows. I cut the engine and sat in the car for a minute. The air was warm, without even a hint of a breeze. It was that distinct, heavy quiet you only find in residential neighborhoods late in late June. Then I pulled out the key and walked up to the front door. I had barely stepped inside before taking off my coat when I heard it. The sound came from the study at the far end of the hallway on the second floor. It was the muffled sound of a drawer being closed with extreme caution. That was followed by a low, brief voice, spoken with the specific ease of someone entirely convinced they are alone in the building. I didn't march to the base of the stairs to shout. I stepped into the shadow to the right of the entryway and stood still long enough to be completely certain of what I was hearing. Then I moved toward the staircase, hugging the left side of the wall where the steps were firmest and least likely to creak. I climbed up until I reached the third step, where I had a clear line of sight down the hall to the study door. A thin sliver of light was bleeding out from underneath it. A shadow moved behind it, pacing slowly back and forth. 2 people were moving around with that deliberate, cautious quiet unique to those who believe no one is watching. Then, heard her voice. "The password is 1612. Try it again." It wasn't loud, just a whisper, but it carried a strange sense of absolute certainty, as if she were stating an undeniable fact rather than making a guess. I recognized that voice instantly, and just as quickly, I recognized the person behind it. I stood frozen on that third step. I didn't move an inch. I allowed everything I had just heard to settle, turning it into something I could examine rationally. What happened next wasn't something I initiated. My security system uses a delayed indoor motion sensor with a 30-second buffer, giving me time to enter and disarm the alarm before it triggers. Marcus and Diane had already been inside, staying relatively still in the study, so they hadn't set it off. But my entry did. The moment I walked through the front hall, while the system was armed, the countdown began. The automated voice from the kitchen panel sounded completely flat and mechanical. Alarm. Motion detected. Emergency services notified.
Estimate arrival. 3 minutes.
The shadows under the study door stopped moving instantly. Marcus was the first to step out. He wore a dark jacket with his hands resting casually at his sides, a posture meant to project complete composure. In the hallway light, his face was noticeably pale, and that easygoing charm he had maintained over the last 4 years of shared offices and client dinners was completely gone. He looked at me and started to speak. "Arthur, Standing my ground, I said calmly. I made it back earlier than expected. When he tried to speak again, I gave a single, slow shake of my head. That was all it took. Diane stepped out a half step behind him. Her face didn't go pale. Instead, it turned completely expressionless, which was an entirely different story. Her gaze shifted to me with the cold, calculated focus of someone making rapid internal assessments. I picked up on the contrast between their reactions right away. I didn't say a word about it. 2 officers arrived in less than 4 minutes. I met them at the front door. Technically, everything I told them was accurate. My son-in-law was inside. The internal sensors were activated when I entered while the system was armed, and as of that moment, I had no specific incident to report. I hadn't checked the study windows yet. I hadn't looked at the latches. Every word I spoke was true. I simply hadn't uncovered the full truth just yet. The officers glanced at Marcus. He kept up a relaxed, cooperative expression, looking to anyone who didn't know him like a family member, who had simply stayed too late and lost track of time. Diane offered a faint, apologetic smile that looked completely natural on the surface. The officers thanked me and took off. I closed the door behind them. "Go get some sleep," I said. "We'll talk tomorrow." I said it without a trace of emotion and with zero intention of following through. I watched their headlights fade down Ridgemont Avenue until they disappeared into the night. Then, still wearing my coat, I stood alone in the dark hallway. A single, overwhelming fact kept echoing in my mind. Diane knew the password, 1612. Not Marcus, but Diane. The way she had said that number carried the quiet confidence of someone who had memorized it long before tonight. It wasn't a guess, and it wasn't a lucky stab in the dark. Someone had given her that code, and she had arrived with it already in mind. I started thinking about what was actually stored on that laptop. It wasn't the standard financial network on the company's server that Marcus had legitimate access to. My personal laptop contained a folder he couldn't reach from the office. Private company documents kept off the server on purpose. The original LLC registration papers, shareholder meeting minutes, and a personal asset valuation completed 6 months ago that had never been uploaded anywhere. Whoever was in that study tonight needed to know precisely what was in those files and where to find them. I walked toward the back of the house. To keep the air circulating during the summer, I always left the study window cracked open, and there I found something I had never had a reason to look for before. A tiny, precise scratch mark on the lower edge of the window latch, far too neat to be an accident. I examined it under my phone's flashlight for a long time. Then I went upstairs without calling anyone. I didn't sleep a wink. By the time the last trace of their headlights vanished down Ridgemont Avenue, the street had fallen completely silent. I stood in the dark hallway, coat still on, keys still in my hand, letting the facts line up until I could see the full picture clearly. The question wasn't whether I should act. The question was how far ahead I was willing to think before taking a step. Calling the police back right then meant pressing charges against Marcus Wayne for unauthorized entry, which under Indiana law was a minor offense. For a first-time offender with a competent defense lawyer, it would likely be reduced to probation or a simple fine. Marcus would have a top-tier defense lawyer by noon. He would figure out exactly what I knew. I would end up tipping my hand for a minor charge that might get dismissed or reduced long before it ever reached a courtroom, leaving me right back where I started, with nothing to show for it. I needed to see the entire picture first, not just the single fragment I was holding at 3 a.m. The complete picture, and I needed to build it quietly, making no visible moves until the right moment arrived. I walked to the back of the house and used a heavy flashlight to inspect the study window latch. The scratch I had spotted under my phone light was even clearer now. The latch had been pried open from the outside. Someone had slid a narrow tool into the gap between the window frame and the lock mechanism, turning it with patience and absolute control. There were no marks from multiple attempts, no splintering along the wood frame. It was the clean, deliberate work of someone who was confident they had plenty of time. I stood by the window for a moment before stepping back inside. Patience, rather than desperation, that distinction mattered more than anything I had seen so far. I walked over to the kitchen keypad and dialed the security monitoring company. The number was listed on a sticker inside the panel door. An operator answered on the second ring. "Could you verify the account password, please?" she asked. I gave her the information. She updated the system with a new access code and read back the confirmation without a hint of emotion. "Is there anything else we can do for you tonight, sir?" "No," I said. "That'll be all for tonight." After hanging up, I stood alone in the kitchen. The external perimeter sensors hadn't gone off when they entered, which meant they had either slipped in through the window before the night alarm activated, or they knew the system's exact arming schedule. I kept both possibilities in mind without jumping to conclusions. I stood there a little longer before going upstairs. The house was dead quiet. Whatever had been set in motion in that study tonight wasn't going to look any simpler by morning. It was 3:15 a.m. I changed out of my travel clothes and headed back downstairs at 3:45, spreading the first and second quarter financial summaries across the kitchen table. I had carried those papers in my briefcase all week, intending to review them on the drive back. But plans had changed. Before reading the very first line, I sat back and thought about the date I had been carrying in my head ever since I stood on that third step. December 16th, 1998. I remembered what Margaret said to me that night. The two of us were sitting on overturned wooden crates inside an empty restaurant space. The fresh paint on the walls wasn't even dry yet. We poured champagne into paper cups because we didn't have proper glasses, and neither of us wanted to wait. "You're going to work here for the rest of your life, aren't you?" she asked. It wasn't really a question. "Most likely," I told her. She smiled. "Ah, good." Long after Margaret passed away, I chose that date as the password for my personal laptop. Not the day the restaurant officially opened, but the night right before. Back when the place was just an empty room, holding a big dream. I had never shared that story with an employee, a business partner, or a client. I had only told it once. Years later during a Sunday family dinner, when the conversation naturally drifted that way, as conversations sometimes do. Claire, my daughter, was 22 at the time. Our conversation was quiet and brief, and neither of us had brought it up since. Sitting under the kitchen light, I spent a long time reflecting on what that meant. I didn't say it out loud. I had a lot of work to do before I was ready to confront that specific reality. I turned to the supplier section of the second quarter report and began reading. 3 pages in, I found it. I read the line twice before speaking. I said it out loud softly, the way you sometimes voice a thought just to prove to yourself that your eyes aren't playing tricks on you. I don't recognize this name. Russo Culinary Partners. Strategic Consulting Services, $18,900, August 2023. 26 years in this business, and I knew every single name I ever wrote a check to. I pulled up the scanned authorization form from the shared drive, the document bearing my signature that approved the payment. I studied it closely under the overhead light. The forgery was remarkably skilled, good enough to pass by anyone who wasn't looking for a discrepancy. But having signed business papers for over 2 decades, I knew the precise flow of my own handwriting. The second loop in the letter R of Mercer was slightly too upright. That wasn't my natural angle. The pressure on the final stroke was lighter than the letters before it. It was the work of another hand finishing what someone else had started. That wasn't my signature. I set the paper down. I cross-referenced the authorization date with my personal calendar. That week, I had been in Indianapolis. Hotel receipts, conference registrations, mileage, logs, everything was accounted for, fully documented, time-stamped. On the exact day I allegedly signed that form, I wasn't anywhere near Caldwell. That meant, while I was 2 states away, someone was signing my name to company funds. I needed help, professional help of 2 specific kinds. I needed to take action before anything inside that financial system had the chance to be quietly altered. At 8:15 the next morning, I called Nora Phelps. I didn't use my cell phone. I used the landline in the kitchen, a number I had kept for 19 years and had never shared with Marcus. Nora had served as the company bookkeeper for 13 years. She knew the vendor records better than anyone in the building, including me. That was precisely why I was calling her. And that was precisely why I used a number she wouldn't recognize. She answered on the 3rd ring. I asked about Russo Culinary Partners, when the vendor account had been created, who had authorized adding it, and whether there was an authorization sheet bearing my signature on file. She paused before answering. It wasn't a long pause, and it wasn't the kind of delay that comes from searching through records. It was the pause of someone who already knew what was being asked and was weighing how to respond. The first invoice was processed last August, she said. There is an authorization sheet on file, yes. It has your signature. All the paperwork is complete. Yes, Mr. Mercer, every piece of it. I paid close attention to the steady tone in her voice, choosing to stay silent. I asked my next question casually, the way you ask about something you already know, just to hear how another person phrases it. Who authorized adding this vendor to the system? Another pause. This one was shorter, more guarded. The file shows it was your authorization. All right, I said. Pull the original authorization form for that vendor, scan it, and email it to my personal account. I gave her the address, not the corporate email, but my private account, reserved exclusively for matters that didn't belong on the shared server. Nora's silence before responding this time lasted longer than any of the previous ones. Okay, give me a few minutes. 11 minutes later, the scan hit my inbox. I sat at the kitchen table studying it, placing it, side by side with the printout I had pulled earlier for comparison. It was the exact same file I had pulled from the shared server and examined at 3 in the morning. Under the bright morning light, the forgery was just as obvious. The loop on the second R in Mercer was too vertical. The final stroke lacked pressure, the clear mark of a different hand completing a stroke someone else had initiated. Daylight didn't make bad news any easier to swallow, but it made it crystal clear. What lay before me confirmed what I already knew. That was all I needed. At 9:15, I called Helen Marsh's law firm. Marsh was a corporate and civil litigation attorney whose services I had never needed, having spent 26 years building a company that avoided those kinds of disputes. But somewhere over the past 16 months, things had shifted. The receptionist asked about the nature of the matter. Corporate and personal, I said, both. A brief pause. Attorney Marsh can see you tomorrow morning at 9. That works. I drove to the commercial center at my usual time and took the elevator up to the 3rd floor. As I stepped out, Marcus was standing in the main hallway, wearing his coat, a coffee mug in one hand, and his phone pressed to his ear. When he saw me, he held up a hand in greeting. I raised mine in response. For the past 4 years, we had shared that exact same gesture every single workday morning. Nothing was different on the surface. That was precisely how it needed to look. I sat at my desk and reviewed 3 months of vendor account records line by line. Russo Culinary Partners appeared 11 times during the period I checked. Every single invoice fell into the exact same price range. Each one was intentionally kept just below the $20,000 threshold I had established years ago for secondary review, the limit that required a second signature. When the running total on the margin of my notepad crossed $140,000, I stopped adding. I closed the folder. I turned the notepad face down. At 2:30 p.m., I walked over to Marcus's open doorway. I had a genuine question for him, nothing fabricated or meant as a trap. The lease extension for the North Caldwell location was coming up in September. I asked him where things stood with the landlord's terms. He didn't hesitate for a second. Square footage, lease duration, the landlord's terms, and the contact details for the property management firm. Fast, thorough, delivered with the easy confidence of a man who knew his job inside and out. "Thanks," I said. "I'll look over the documents later this week." I walked back to my desk. I reviewed 2 vendor contracts I would normally have delegated, an upcoming property assessment for the East Side location, and a quarterly staffing report. I didn't hand off a single task. I worked with my office door open. I didn't look over toward Marcus's office any more than I would have on any ordinary day. At 5:40, we exchanged our standard hallway. Goodbye, a couple of meaningless pleasantries forgotten before the elevator doors even closed. I took the stairs instead. I walked to my car in the parking garage, got inside, and sat there with the engine off. Kicked into the rain. I had spent 8 hours in the exact same building with a man who had been quietly siphoning funds from the company for 16 months. For 8 straight hours, I had reviewed his forged work, walked up to his door, thanked him for his answers, and returned to my desk without a single visible change in how I spoke or acted. I had spent an entire workday executing a performance I had never rehearsed, one I hadn't even known I would need to give until late last night. Sitting in the quiet of the car, I could feel the sheer weight of that effort, the heavy toll of constant, rigid self-control. I didn't know how many more days like this lay ahead, but I knew there would be more. I started the engine. Pulling out of the garage, it hit me that I always lock my office door whenever I leave. I had done it for years without a second thought. But for the very first time, I actually pondered why. Every lock, every habit, every system I had built around this company was grounded in a single assumption: that I could trust the people I chose, and that their trust had been earned. I had never stopped to examine how that trust was earned, or whether my belief in it was ever grounded in reality. I needed an accurate picture of what I truly knew and who had guided my perception. Helen Marsh's office occupied the 8th floor of a downtown building, where the elevators ran silently, and the deep carpets swallowed every footstep. Her name was etched into frosted glass beside a solid hardwood door. When I walked in, I met a woman in her 50s who looked like she had heard every variation of every story imaginable, and had long since ceased to be surprised by anything. That suited my needs perfectly. Her conference room featured a long table devoid of any unnecessary clutter. I arranged my documents in order. Quarterly financial reports, filled with my handwritten notes showing clear discrepancies. Full-sized printouts of the forged authorization forms. And travel records, covering every single day. My signature had supposedly been affixed to those documents. Hotel receipts, registration logs, mileage records. 16 months of evidence, organized the way I approached anything important. Chronologically, with zero gaps. Marsh read through every single page without saying a word. She picked up the main authorization form, holding it at reading distance. Then she set it back down on the table. Ford, she noted, stating it as a simple fact rather than a question. It was the exact same flat certainty I had arrived at, alone in my kitchen at 3 a.m, now validated by an attorney with 25 years of trial experience who had zero reason to say anything other than what lay right in front of her. She laid out the risks with complete clarity. As Chief Operating Officer, Marcus Wayne possessed the knowledge and administrative access to move assets the moment he sensed something was wrong. He could transfer funds into third-party accounts, restructure holdings, and create legal obligations that would complicate any freeze order a court might issue. Filing a petition prematurely with incomplete evidence would simply give him time to mount a defense. If even a single whisper reached his ears before the paperwork was filed, those accounts could become unreachable long before the legal system caught up. She needed 2 to 3 weeks, not as a preference but as an absolute requirement. She brought up 2 names. The first was Victor Hale, a certified public accountant with no prior ties to Mercer Catering, known for being methodical and independent, recording his investigative steps with absolute precision. The second was Ray Dobbs, a licensed investigator who had spent nearly 2 decades handling commercial fraud cases right here in Caldwell. He prefers writing things down by hand rather than typing them up, Marsh remarked. It's an old habit from his earlier career. I've found that when situations get complicated, it tells you a lot about how a person thinks. She set her pen down and looked at me directly. You cannot breathe a word of this to anyone. Not your bookkeeper, not your head chef, not a single person who walks through that office door. If word leaks out and reaches Marcus Wayne before we file, the money will vanish long before we can step in. I understand, I replied. I need to know you are fully committed to this. I am. Before starting my car, I called Victor Hale and Ray Dobbs from the parking garage beneath her building. Both conversations were brief and focused entirely on logistics. Hale could begin his financial audit on Tuesday. Dobbs mentioned he would need a few days to map out the full scope before committing to a firm timeline. I issued identical instructions to both men, work quietly, communicate exclusively through a private email address I would provide, and tell no one about their involvement. Neither man asked why secrecy was necessary. That told me everything I needed to know about their professionalism. I returned to the commercial center before 3 and worked at my desk through the end of the afternoon. At 3:15, Marcus walked into the break room holding a coffee mug. He was still wearing his jacket, carrying that effortless composure that made every room look like it had been arranged solely for his convenience. I walked over and joined him. We stood by the counter just like we had on dozens of ordinary afternoons. He mentioned that Diane was considering taking a Tuesday evening cooking class. Italian culinary techniques at a studio in the Arts District. Sounds like a nice change of pace, I said. It didn't sound like a nice change of pace at all. I stood there, taking in every word Marcus spoke, noticing the subtle trait I had observed for 4 years. An unhurried tone and an intense focus that made a casual conversation feel like the only thing in the building worth paying attention to. I had spent 4 years interpreting that quality as a natural gift for handling people. Walking back to my desk, I began to see it in a very different light. On the drive home, my mind drifted back to the dinner, where Claire first introduced Marcus 3 years ago at a restaurant on the East Side. He had asked about the early days of Mercer Catering, the funding, the original location, and the risky decisions that kept us afloat. There was real preparation behind those questions. Afterward, I told Claire, he really did his homework. I said it as the highest compliment I knew how to give. Sitting in the evening traffic on the way home, I began to realize what that compliment actually meant to the person sitting across the table. I pulled into the driveway and sat with the engine off. I looked up at the study window, which was now securely locked from the inside. Before 7 that morning, I had replaced the old latch with a heavy-duty mechanical lock bought at a hardware store on Caldwell Avenue. 3 days ago, a handwritten address book that had rested in the top right drawer of my check for 11 years was still sitting in its usual spot. The morning after the intrusion, I had locked it inside a secure safe. I looked at the window a moment longer. I wondered what else in that room had been examined, which pages had been turned, which documents had been read, how many times they had been inside, and over how long a period. I had no answers. Sitting in the quiet darkness of my own drive, I began to understand that the absence of those answers was no accident. It was the most successful part of their plan. The appointment at Dr. Wiles' clinic was something I hadn't mentioned to Marsh, Hale, or Dobbs. It was a visit I had scheduled myself 3 days after discovering the forged signature. And on Thursday afternoon, while Marcus was out conducting a site visit on the West Side, I drove there alone. The money, as it turned out, wasn't even the most terrifying discovery. Here is the natural, smooth, and narrative-ready American English script, fully optimized for YouTube storytelling and safe for AI text-to-speech tools. The single most terrifying part wasn't even the stolen money, but the quiet question lurking right behind it. How could I miss a systematic fraud that had been going on under my roof for 16 straight months? Was my judgment finally starting to slip? I was 61 years old. I had built 26 years of my career on a simple, absolute faith in my own mind, relying on my ability to read documents, evaluate complex situations, size up people, and see the reality right in front of me. If that sharp edge had dulled without me realizing it, then the fraud itself was actually the least of my problems. Before I could trust another decision I made, I needed a cold, hard answer about my own mental state. And that wasn't a question I could answer on my own. That was the whole point. The comprehensive evaluation in Dr. Kenneth Weil's office took 2 hours and 20 minutes, split into 3 separate sessions with brief breaks in between. Dr. Weil was deliberate, steady, offering no explanations for what he was measuring along the way. Memory retention, logical reasoning, sustained focus, and a detailed personal health history. An hour in, he finally set his pen down on the desk and looked at me across the room. "Irving," he said, addressing me directly, "what specific concern brought you here today?" I paused for a moment to choose my words carefully. "I'm worried I missed something I should have caught much sooner. Something that went on for 16 months. Dr. Weil jotted down a quick note without breaking his calm expression. "And what was the nature of what you missed?" "Financial," I replied. Then, after a brief pause, I added, "and personal." He gave a single, slow nod. "And when you finally uncovered it, how did you react?" "Methodically," I said. He stared at me for a few seconds, writing nothing down. It wasn't unkind, just the sharp, undivided focus of a professional filing a key detail, a way to re-examine later. Then he jotted down a final line. "The full results will be ready in 2 to 3 weeks." He promised to give me a call as soon as everything was finalized. On the drive home, I ended up passing an estate sale set up on a quiet side street, just 2 blocks off the main road. It was a casual setup with folding tables in the driveway and handwritten price tags taped to old items. Sitting right on the edge of the lawn was a mahogany sideboard, its top veneer curling upward and the glue along one of its legs split completely open. Decades of built-up wax had left the finish dull, topped off by an ugly, sloppy fresh coat. Everyone walking past the sale gave it a wide berth. I asked the seller for a price. $45. Buppies, and I loaded it into my trunk myself and drove the rest of the way home. Late that evening, I set the piece down on my workbench in the garage studio, doing nothing to it at first, just taking it in. I inspected every inch of the surface, approaching it the way you start any project worth doing right. Despite the outer wear, the core structure underneath was perfectly intact, featuring excellent craftsmanship with tight mortise and tenon joints in every single corner. It was solid wood that had been seasoned properly long before the carpenter ever shaped it. Every flaw I found was purely superficial, added on over time from the outside, while the real foundation underneath remained completely untouched. The damage was strictly on the surface. That distinction mattered far more than most people realize before taking action. Before you start fixing anything, you have to understand the true nature of what you are dealing with. That isn't just advice. It is the only process that actually works. My mind drifted back to Margaret, standing in the doorway of the studio on warm summer evenings with a coffee mug in her hand, watching me without ever rushing me. She possessed a rare quality I admired for 2 decades without ever truly mastering: the ability to exist fully in the present, never forcing a moment to move faster than its natural pace. She understood that certain tasks had a proper sequence, and that skipping steps didn't save time. It simply ruined the final outcome. She applied that mindset to everything, including the years we spent turning an empty commercial space on Callaway Avenue into a business that outlasted the very decade we built it in. I remembered my daughter Claire when she was 7 or 8 years old, handing me tools whose names she hadn't even learned yet. She would stretch her small arms up to reach the pegboard and pass me whatever was closest. I would name each tool for her, explaining what it was meant for, and she would repeat the words with careful precision before reaching for the next one. I couldn't pinpoint exact moment I had stopped doing that with her. I just knew it happened gradually over time, the way those subtle shifts usually do. A few quiet days passed by. Hale was deep into reviewing the full account ledgers, while Dobbs confirmed the existence of the Shell LLC and began assembling a complete profile on it. I maintained my usual routine at the office, keeping my door wide open and handling daily operations as if nothing was amiss. Late one night, sitting at my workbench beside a can of mineral spirits, my phone lit up. It was a text from Dobbs's secure business line. Found the LLC. Registered right here in Caldwell. Putting the full picture together now. Call me when you're ready. I stared at the screen for a long time before turning the phone face down. I wasn't shocked, because I had already anticipated it. The existence of the company was a reality I was fully prepared to accept. The real question was whose name was listed on the official filings, and Dobbs needed a little more time to hand that over. The truth was quietly taking shape in the background, the way complex matters always do before they are ready for the light of day. I reached for a sheet of medium grit sandpaper and turned my attention back to the mahogany sideboard. The original top coat, the old varnish, and decades of built-up wax, everything applied over the years that obscured the true grain beneath, had to be completely stripped away before any real restoration work could begin. That was the exact phase most people wanted to rush or skip. Altogether, it was slow, unglamorous, and yielded no visible reward for a very long time. But through countless projects over many years, I had learned that this step could never be rushed because it formed the foundation every future step depended on. Dobbs called early Tuesday morning while I was still sitting at my workbench, long before the official business day started. He told me he had assembled the complete picture on the Shell Company. The steady, measured tone of his voice told me everything I needed to know. This was the kind of situation that only looked worse the longer you examined it. His office on Harrison Street sat on the second floor, reached by a simple exterior staircase. It consisted of a single main room with a desk, a guest chair, and a heavy filing cabinet against the wall. It was a quiet, functional space built for serious work without any unnecessary flair. Dobbs was a solid man in his mid-50s who moved with quiet efficiency, clearly someone who had learned never to rush when focus was required. He set a thick file folder on the desk between us and opened it up without any preliminary small talk. Russo Culinary Partners. The Shell Company had been officially formed 16 months ago. The sole managing member was Diane Carroll, listed under her maiden name rather than her married name, Diane Wayne. The registered agent was a flat-fee business filing service in Caldwell that had zero direct connection to anyone involved beyond taking the initial filing payment. The primary business address was listed at a commercial mailbox center on Callaway Avenue, just 4 blocks away from my own house on Ridgemont Avenue. A business checking account was opened at a local credit union on the exact same day the LLC was formed. The monthly deposits flowing into that account matched the exact numbers listed on the fictitious vendor invoices inside Mercer Catering's internal system. Every payment was an exact match in both timing and dollar amount, far too precise to ever be dismissed as a coincidence. The current balance, as of Dobbs's audit, 3 days prior, stood at $47,200. They haven't drained the account yet, I noted. Not yet, Dobbs replied smoothly. What warranted even closer examination was how Diane had crossed paths with Marcus in the first place. Dobbs had dug up her professional profile online. While set to private, it was accessible through mutual industry connections. Back in late August of 2021, Marcus had posted a public update announcing his plans to attend a regional food and beverage conference down in Atlanta. He had tagged the venue, listed the dates, and shared a standard professional update. Diane had left a comment on that exact post within 48 hours. An associate of Dobbs who attended that same conference recalled a woman matching Diane's exact description at a networking reception on the second evening. She hadn't just engaged in casual chatter. She was asking remarkably targeted questions about mid-sized, independent restaurant operators in our area. Among the specific names dropped, she asked directly, "Who holds the most established long-term footprint in the Caldwell market right now?" The associate remembered the exchange vividly because the line of questioning was surprisingly detailed for someone who had just been introduced. "How did your contact describe her demeanor while she was asking?" I asked Dobbs, like someone who already had a specific target in mind and was simply verifying her research with people in the room. The timeline laid it out with absolute clarity. Marcus posted his conference plans 2 weeks beforehand. Diane commented within 48 hours. Her own conference registration was processed after his post went live, not before. She had actively confirmed his attendance before booking her own trip to make sure she was in the exact same room. So she knew he was going to be there before she ever registered, I concluded. Dobbs didn't disagree. That's precisely what the paper trail shows. He closed the folder. There's more to uncover. Give me 3 more days to run a deep dive on her professional background, and I'll have everything we need. I thanked him, walked down the outdoor stairs, and got back into my car. I sat in the parking lot beneath his office, with the ignition off, letting the geographic reality settle in my mind. That fraudulent business address was located just 4 blocks from my front door. I had driven past that mailbox center on Callaway Avenue hundreds of times over the last 26 years without ever seeing it as anything more than another ordinary building on a familiar street. Diane had chosen it deliberately. It was close enough to blend in naturally, for anyone with a reason to be in the neighborhood, but distant enough to avoid drawing red flags during standard internal vendor audits. The name of the LLC was specifically designed to blend in with standard supplier categories. The entire structure had been engineered to remain completely invisible right under my nose. My mind flashed back to the very first time I shook her hand. It was at Claire's apartment on a warm Sunday afternoon, 2 years after Marcus had joined the firm. She gave a firm handshake, maintained direct eye contact, and asked thoughtful questions about our business operations that showed she had done her homework. It wasn't overbearing, just remarkably thorough. It was the kind of preparation you noticed immediately without feeling unsettled by it. On the drive home that evening, I had remarked to Claire, "She really did her research." I meant it as a genuine compliment back then, having no other framework to understand her actions. My initial read on her thorough preparation was spot on. I had simply failed to realize what she was actually preparing for, or just how far back that preparation had really begun. I turned the key, started the engine, and drove toward our corporate office. I parked in the garage, took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and passed Marcus in the hallway with a calm morning greeting. He was stepping out of the break room with a mug of coffee, his phone already in hand. He moved with the relaxed ease of a man who experienced zero friction in his daily life. I sat down at my desk, opened an asset valuation report, and began working through the figures, keeping my eyes on my own work without looking toward his office any more than usual. Later that afternoon, a short text from Dobbs landed in my private inbox, uncovered new details on Rousseau's history beyond the bad marriage and her departure from the law firm. Give me 3 days. After reading it, I set my phone face down on the desk. 3 more days. Ever since that night in the hallway, I had been taking this entire ordeal one single day at a time. Waiting 3 more days was well within my ability to handle. Victor Hale called early Wednesday morning, asking if I could drop by his office later that afternoon. He spoke with the quiet authority of a professional whose work was finished and ready for a formal presentation. I cleared my afternoon calendar and drove to his office on the southeast side of the business district. His workspace had been converted into a full presentation setup. An entire wall was covered by a massive whiteboard, displaying 19 separate columns, each representing a fraudulent invoice, stretching from the top of the board down to a solid line near the bottom, marking a systematic 60-week operation. He had used a thick black marker to separate the fake company entries from our legitimate vendor records. Every figure tied to the fraudulent account was written out in bright red ink. Hale walked me through the breakdown column by column. Every single invoice was billed for strategic culinary consulting services, using the exact same service category and description. And in every single instance, there was a complete absence of deliverables. No actual work product, no meeting logs, and no documented services rendered. Each document was formatted using the exact same font, margins, and layout as Mercer Catering's real vendor invoices, executed with such extreme consistency that nothing would ever raise suspicion during a standard batch review. Every authorization form bore a forged signature that expertly mimicked the general flow of my handwriting. Furthermore, every single invoice fell strictly between $10,400 and $18,900. All 19 invoices, without exception, stayed comfortably with $20,000 threshold I had established years ago for mandatory secondary review. I had originally set that limit to keep routine vendor payments moving quickly without requiring a second sign-off. The internal control I had built to reduce unnecessary paperwork had been turned into the exact tool used to bypass a second set of eyes. Whoever set this up was fully aware of your exact authorization limits, Hale noted. They knew our internal approval process inside and out, I replied. He gave a single nod and wrote the final summary at the bottom of the board. $284,000 across 16 months over 19 separate invoices. I stared at that final red number in silence for a moment. I had calculated a rough estimate in my own notes weeks ago, but seeing a rough figure in a private notebook was entirely different from seeing an official total written in red ink by a certified auditor. The former was a quiet suspicion pieced together in a kitchen at night. The latter was an undeniable fact that would remain permanently etched in legal filings. I thanked Hale for his meticulous work. He assured me he would have the final documentation packaged for legal review within 48 hours. I drove back to the corporate office. Marcus's door was open, as it usually was at that time of day. He was on a call with a client, his relaxed voice drifting effortlessly down the quiet hallway. He possessed a specific tone for those calls, unhurried, deeply attentive, ending at just the right moment with a light, warm laugh. For 4 years, I had listened to that tone and interpreted it as professional composure, a natural ability to put people at ease that I had often admitted to Claire. And myself, I never naturally possessed. I viewed that trait through an entirely different lens now. 4 years as Chief Operating Officer had given Marcus complete access to every supplier category, every approval protocol, and every financial threshold built into our company. During his first few months on the job, I had personally walked him through every single one of those procedures, thoroughly and completely. That was how I onboarded anyone I trusted, with operational authority. I thought I was training a capable executive to manage our growth. In reality, I was handing a clear blueprint to someone who was systematically identifying every weakness in the system from day one. I locked Hale's final report inside the combination compartment of my briefcase rather than leaving it in my office. I reviewed 3 genuine vendor contracts, updated 2 project schedules, and worked steadily at my desk until the afternoon light faded into evening. At 5:40 p.m., my private cell phone chimed. It was Nora Phelps. In 13 years of working together, she had never once called my private number after business hours. And the moment I picked up, she addressed me by my last name, something she had never done before. Her voice carried a deliberate, practiced control, the tone of someone who had made a firm decision and rehearsed her opening lines before placing the call. It wasn't panic. It was deep, calculated intention. The sheer caution in her voice conveyed a message long before she spoke a full sentence. "Mr. Mercer, I need to speak with you, but not at the office." There was a brief pause, shorter than the one I had noticed during our first phone call. It was obvious she had used the time between then and now to reach the exact point she was at tonight. "Can I come to your house?" I glanced down the hallway. The light in Marcus's office was still on. I recalled Attorney Marsh's strict instruction from across the conference table weeks ago. Do not tell a single soul inside your organization, not your bookkeeper of 13 years. No one. Everything Marsh had warned me about was completely valid. Yet Nora had just dialed my private line after hours asking to meet at my home, a request that had no ordinary explanation within a standard working relationship. 8 o'clock, I said quietly. Use the back entrance. I ended the call, slipped the phone into my pocket, and stepped into the hall. Marcus was packing up his desk, wearing his coat with his briefcase in hand. Projecting that same effortless end-of-day composure I had mistaken for job satisfaction for 4 long years. We exchanged a few pleasantries, completely unremarkable. Then he walked out. I waited until I saw his car exit the parking garage before heading down to my own. On the drive home, I processed the phone call from every angle without jumping to conclusions. I had no idea what Nora was planning to reveal. But I knew, with quiet certainty, that the picture I had spent 6 long weeks piecing together was about to gain a dimension I had never even thought to look for. She arrived 12 minutes early, which caught me off guard. She set a small overnight bag down, just inside the kitchen door, and never opened it, as if she had packed it on impulse, without knowing what she would need, only to forget it the moment she walked in. I guided her to the kitchen table. She sat down, laying both hands flat on the surface before her. I recognized that posture immediately. I had seen it a few times in my life from people who had carried a heavy burden for far too long and could no longer keep it upright. She took a slow, deep breath to begin. A clear, deliberate breath used when someone has rehearsed their words and resolved to lay everything out. It started with an accounting error. Back in February of 2020, during the chaotic first quarter of the pandemic, our firm was restructuring its vendor payment schedules, and every account was in flux. An entry for $8,400 was accidentally transposed, processed under the wrong vendor code, and misallocated to the wrong expense account. It was a minor internal discrepancy during a massive operational shift. She discovered the mistake herself 6 weeks later during a routine audit and corrected it quietly. It was a simple adjustment that raised zero alarms and required no public disclosure, leading her to believe the matter was resolved for good. She continued working under that belief for 2 years, until Marcus uncovered it. It was no accident. Leveraging his high-level access as COO, he had dug into archived internal logs from fiscal year 2020, working backward from the correction to determine what had happened and why. It wasn't a casual search. He had sifted through 18 months of archived entries just to isolate that single 6-week period. On a quiet afternoon in September of 2022, he walked into Nora's office and set the file on her desk. He didn't raise his voice or make explicit threats. He simply sat down, placed the documents before her, and calmly reviewed the numbers, outlining how the discrepancy could be interpreted, the devastating impact it could have on her CPA certification at 58 years old, the loss of her professional references, and the destruction of 13 years of trust at a company that would now question her integrity. He framed the entire conversation as a helpful courtesy, leaving the ultimate conclusion entirely up to her. Over the next 11 months, Nora quietly provided Marcus with my personal signing schedule, the exact document templates used for vendor authorization forms, our internal vendor code calendar, and my complete travel calendar. She handed over each piece of information separately over time, creating enough distance between requests that it never felt like a single, massive act of betrayal in the moment. She convinced herself she was simply complying with a request in a difficult situation, intentionally avoiding the bigger picture of what he was actually building. 2 weeks ago, during a routine compliance review, she pulled a Russo Culinary Partners invoice from the archives. She recognized the formatting immediately, the exact margins, the precise font, and the layout. It was the exact template she had provided to Marcus the previous autumn. Sitting before that document, she spent 2 full days suffering in silence, before finally picking up the phone to call me. It took her 2 days to decide if what she had done was something she could ever explain to another human being. I sat in complete silence, letting her lay out every single detail. When she finally finished, I asked a single, calm question. "How long has he been holding this over you?" 11 months, she whispered. I sat with that answer for a moment. I wasn't reflecting on the timeline itself, which already aligned with my audit findings, but rather on a specific word she used, the present tense, implying an ongoing pressure. I told her to head home. Do not alter a single record in the system. Do not touch any files. And do not say a single word to Marcus. She looked at me across the table with tired eyes. Am I going to lose my job? I looked back at her calmly. You've given 13 years to this company, Nora. Go home and get some rest. She reached for her bag. Before she stood up, I added, I will have my attorney connect you with independent legal counsel. Do not discuss any of this formally with anyone without an attorney present. She froze for a second. That instruction wasn't what she had expected when she walked through my door. She had arrived expecting a painful confession and left with legal protection rather than immediate punishment. She gave a silent nod and exited quietly through the back door. At 11 o'clock that night, I walked out to my garage studio. I sat on the stool beside my workbench, without touching a single tool, letting the full scope of the evening settle into place. I reviewed everything Nora had handed to Marcus over those 11 months, my signing schedule, the document templates, the vendor codes, and my travel itinerary. Every piece of logistical puzzle required to construct and execute a systematic fraud against our corporate authorization setup. Everything needed to know when I would be out of state, what my signed forms looked like, and how to format a fraudulent payment so it sailed under the mandatory review threshold. Everything was accounted for except one specific detail. Nora had never known the password to my personal laptop. She never knew 1612. She couldn't have given that code to Marcus or anyone else. That password had come from a completely different source. From someone who didn't just know the 4 digits, but understood the precise reason why those numbers existed in the first place. December 16th. Margaret and I sitting in an empty restaurant space the night before our official opening, drinking champagne out of paper cups because we didn't own real glasses yet. I had shared that story with only one living person in my entire life. I didn't say the name out loud in the quiet studio. I didn't need to. I sat there in the dark, contemplating what it meant if that password had been passed along carelessly, perhaps dropped casually in a private conversation without realizing how it could be weaponized, repeated as a harmless piece of family history. I also sat there and confronted what it meant if the code hadn't been shared by accident at all. Both possibilities pointed back to the exact same origin, but only one of them carried a heartbreaking weight. I wasn't ready to push for an answer to that question just yet. Before I could go there, other work had to be completed first. I reached for the cracked leg of the mahogany sideboard, turning it slowly in my hands. A repaired joint had to cure completely before it could ever be tested under real pressure. That was a phase you could never rush. Until the bonding process finished on its own timeline, there was no way to know if the repair would truly hold. I turned off the workbench light and headed back inside the house. Tomorrow, Dobbs promised he would have the full truth about Diane Russo. Dobbs called my private line early Wednesday morning instead of reaching out through the main office. He only used that line when the information he held was fully verified rather than just a strong lead. He announced that he had assembled the complete picture on Diane Russo, the way he delivered her name, with a deliberate, heavy pause before it. Told me whatever he had uncovered was about to reshape everything. I thought I understood. I arrived at his office on Harrison Street and took the chair opposite his desk. Just as I had 3 weeks earlier, when he handed me the preliminary LLC documents and asked for more time. He had used every hour of that time wisely. Diane Russo, 34 years old, was a former corporate attorney at a prominent regional firm, specializing in business acquisitions and corporate entity structuring. Her expertise lay in the exact legal architecture required for mergers, ownership transfers, and setting up entities to hold specific asset classes. She had practiced law at that firm for 6 years before leaving in the spring of 2022. Her deep professional background meant she understood the technical mechanics perfectly. How to register a shell company to obscure true ownership. How to route vendor payments agreements to bypass routine audits. And how to exploit internal controls if you knew the exact approval thresholds. She had spent 6 years teaching clients how to build structures that minimized accountability. That shell company on Callaway Avenue was no impulsive scheme. It was the refined work of a professional who had mastered those techniques and continued using them long after leaving her firm. Why did she leave the firm? I asked. Dobbs set his pen down on the desk. The official statement reads, "To pursue independent opportunities." Off the record, there was a sensitive client matter the firm chose not to handle publicly. Her departure wasn't entirely voluntary in the traditional sense. It came with strict terms, no public statements, and no formal industry announcements. What kind of client matter are we talking about? The kind that involves walking a very fine line between aggressive client representation and serious regulatory violations. Dobbs said calmly, "I don't have the internal files yet. Give me a little more time on that front." I filed that detail away and pressed forward. 3 weeks earlier, the story about the Atlanta conference had only been partially verified. Dobbs had now confirmed the complete timeline. A woman matching Diane's exact description had attended the September 2021 networking event in Atlanta, specifically asking targeted questions about independent restaurant operators in our region. These weren't casual inquiries, but sharp, calculated questions from someone who had already conducted thorough research and was validating her findings. Marcus had posted his attendance online 2 weeks prior, and Diane had commented on that post within 48 hours. Her conference registration followed her comment. She knew he was going to be there before she ever booked her trip. I noted. Dobbs didn't rephrase it. That is precisely what the paper trail shows. I thanked him, walked down the exterior stairs, and sat in my car with the engine off. Sitting in that parking lot, the evidence pointed to an inescapable conclusion. Diane Russo had set her sights on the Caldwell restaurant market long before she ever zeroed in on Marcus Wayne. She was a corporate attorney with deep expertise in entity structuring, who had departed her firm under quiet pressure while continuing to deploy those exact same skills for her own gain. She had researched the independent operator market in a mid-sized city, identified the best-run business in that sector, and found the ops director's name on a public ops conference attendee list. Then she managed to get herself into the exact same room. Look, I'm willing to admit I could be wrong about any single step in that chain. Coincidences happen, and timing can play tricks on you. But the specific question she asked at that reception, asking who had built the most durable operational model in the Caldwell market, that wasn't a question from someone still looking around. That was asked to confirm a choice that had already been made. It brought me back to our first dinner at Claire's apartment. Diane had asked careful, deliberate questions about the business, our early years, the systems, and the decisions I would have handled differently. I remember telling Claire afterward, "She's done her homework." Turned out I was even more right than I realized. Marcus always thought I was convinced he was the mastermind behind all of it. He ran the vendor program, controlled the authorization chain through Nora, and put on a daily show of loyalty while systematically skimming from the company. But Marcus Wayne was just a name on a public conference registry. That's where this whole thing actually started. He was the door, not the architect. And a man who thinks he's running the show when he isn't reacts very differently under pressure than someone who knows the whole picture. That difference was going to be critical for what was coming next, especially for what Helen Marsh needed to prepare for once we filed. I drove back to the business center. Marcus was at his desk when I walked in. I said good morning, he said it back, and I went into my office and shut the door. Something I almost never do at that time of day. At 9:15, I dialed Helen Marsh. I think we're ready to file the civil complaint, I told her. What do you need from me today to push the button? She needed 3 things. A signed power of attorney, the complete audit package Hale had prepared for legal submission, and my alibi documentation for every date my forged signature appeared on those files. All 3 were sitting in my briefcase. I told her I'd be at her office within the hour. Arthur, Marsh said before hanging up, once we file, the timeline belongs to the court. I understand, I said. And I did. It meant the part of this I could actually control was pretty much over. Marsh filed the civil complaint on Thursday morning. When it was done, she sent me a 1-word text. Filed. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a vendor contract when it came through. I read it, turned my phone face down, and went right back to the contract. That's the weird thing about days when something life-altering is moving beneath the surface. They look identical to every other day. The same phone calls, the same paperwork, the same hallway chats about operational details that would still matter long after the dust settled. The real weight moves underneath, where only you can see it. And your only job that day is to make the surface look like just another routine morning. At 11:20, Marcus's assistant walked into his office carrying a sealed envelope. I happened to be stepping out of my office at that exact second. No planning, no timing, no calculation. I was right there in the hall when he opened it, and I watched. He read through the documents. His face did that thing people's faces do when a quiet, buried fear is suddenly confirmed. A fast tightening around the eyes. A massive shift beneath the surface, followed almost instantly by a trained, near-instinctive stillness. That shift from tension to total stillness took maybe 2 seconds. The speed of it told me everything. That calm wasn't improvised. It was rehearsed. He looked up. I was standing right there. I gave him a brief, neutral nod and walked back to my desk without saying a word. Earlier that afternoon, before I left the building for some errands, I walked past the glass partition near accounting. Nora was at her desk, working through a stack of invoices, steady and completely unbothered. That's the pace of someone who has made a decision and is just living with it. I had been realizing for a while that Marcus wasn't keeping an eye on Nora. He was staring at his own setup, like a guy convinced he could outrun trouble before it caught up to him. Nora was just background noise to him. And that blind spot bought her time she didn't even know she had. That afternoon, I drove across the commercial district along Meridian Street, passing the coffee shop where Marcus and Diane occasionally met. Through the window, I spotted them. Diane had her phone pressed tightly to her ear, her jaw set, one hand flat on the table. Marcus was leaning forward across from her. Not the posture of a man running things, but a man taking orders from the person who was. By any standard, that was not a normal conversation. I kept driving. Marsh called at 5. Her tone was tailored for delivering unwanted, though not entirely unexpected, news. The temporary restraining order was denied. Proving irreparable harm isn't enough at this stage. A civil complaint alone doesn't give the court authority to freeze private accounts. We need a parallel criminal referral before a judge will touch the funds. What do we do in the meantime? I asked. We watch it. Dobbs is monitoring the account closely. As soon as a criminal inquiry runs alongside this, we go back for the freeze, and then we'll have real enforcement power. There was a brief pause on the line. He's going to move that money, I said. He might try, Marsh replied. That's why Dobbs is on it. I worked through the last hour of the business day at my desk. 2 vendor agreements, and 3 routine emails about the lease renewal for the North Caldwell location. I didn't look toward Marcus's office once. The building was mostly empty by 5:30. I locked up and drove home. That night, the phone rang. It was Dobbs. I picked up on the first ring. Activity on the account. What happened? 14-2 moved out this afternoon. New institution, different account name. I'm tracing the destination now. How long after service? 11 hours. I stayed quiet for a moment. Keep tracking it. I set the phone on the kitchen counter and sat down to take stock of everything that had happened that day. The service. At 11:20, the look on Marcus's face, the tightening, the practiced calm. Diane on Meridian Street with her jaw set, and Marcus leaning in. The denied TRO at 5 o'clock, and $14,200 moved within 11 hours of service. Underneath all of it sat the question I had deliberately set aside since that night in the workshop. December 16th, and who besides me actually understood what that date meant? I left it where it was. Certain questions alter every room you walk into, the moment you speak them out loud. I wasn't ready to enter that room yet. I walked out to the workshop. 3 weeks before filing, Marsh had warned me. If he feels the pressure mounting, he'll move assets before we can freeze them. The complaint was filed. The pressure had landed on Marcus's desk at 11:20 a.m. in a sealed envelope, and $14,200 left the account that afternoon. That wasn't a panic move. Panic looks chaotic, disproportionate, rushed, and self-defeating. This was calculated, precise, and measured. It was the response of someone who had a contingency plan ready, long before the summons arrived, and was executing it step by step. I had no doubt Diane had anticipated this moment from the very start. The contingency structure wasn't a defensive measure. It was built into the plan. It was an operating procedure designed for high-stress conditions. I stood under the work light, staring at the surface of the sideboard for a while. Then I turned off the light and headed back inside. I'd need to talk to Marsh in the morning. Before the next wave hit, we needed more safeguards in place. A gut feeling. One, I couldn't quite name yet, was telling me whatever came next was designed to hit me where a civil suit couldn't reach. Helen Marsh called Tuesday morning at 6:58 a.m. I was standing at the kitchen counter with a fresh cup of coffee. She skipped the pleasantries and told me to just listen. I told her I was listening. A petition for legal guardianship and financial conservatorship had been filed in Caldwell County Court. It was submitted on behalf of Marcus Wayne and Diane Rousseau, represented by Philip Greer, a local litigator whose name I'd seen on municipal filings, though I'd never worked with him directly. Grounds cited: alleged cognitive decline in 61-year-old Arthur Mercer. The petition named Marcus as the proposed co-conservator. If granted, a court-appointed conservator would oversee my financial decisions and hold sign-off authority on any business transactions above a court-set threshold. In short, Marcus was trying to use the court system to grab the steering wheel directly out of my hands. The filing listed 5 specific incidents. I listened to every single one without interrupting. 2 instances involved me leaving my building access card on my desk. Marcus had quietly retrieved and returned it both times, making no comment while quietly building a paper trail behind my back. Another was a vendor meeting where I used an incorrect variation of a longtime supplier's name. A mix-up Diane had casually introduced in conversation a week earlier, which I'd unknowingly repeated. Then there was an authorization form signed with a mismatched vendor code, where Marcus had swapped out a page before I reviewed it. Finally, a signed statement from a neighbor, describing what she claimed was a pattern of confusion from me over the months leading up to the filing. Marsh's investigator had already looked into that neighbor's statement. Diane had spent 4 months cultivating that relationship, introducing herself as Marcus's wife and expressing warm, persistent concern over her father-in-law's supposed memory issues. No outright lies, no money exchanged, just a patient, steady drip of a narrative that led a well-meaning neighbor to fill in the blanks with what she genuinely believed were her own observations. The neighbor signed in good faith, which made the statement tricky to attack on the surface, but easy to expose in court as the product of a calculated influence campaign. The petition is professionally embarrassing, no pattern of financial self-harm, no clinical findings whatsoever. Greer should known better than to file this without proper backing, which tells me Marcus pushed him to move early. Somebody panicked after getting that civil summons. Is a petition this weak actually a problem for us? I asked. A weak petition, if it isn't countered immediately and decisively, can freeze business decisions and wreck professional credibility in ways that are tough to undo. Opposing counsel will use the mere existence of the filing to cast doubt, no matter what's inside it. We have to tear it down before the court schedule even gets rolling. Judge Patricia Holden is handling it, and the hearing is set for 2 weeks from Monday. I have something to bring to your office this morning, I told her. I drove to a commercial storage unit on the east side of town and retrieved a sealed envelope I'd placed there 6 weeks earlier. Inside was a complete neurological evaluation from Dr. Kenneth Weil's office. I had deliberately stored it off-site at a facility completely unconnected to my home or business. Sitting at Marsh's conference table, she read through the 16-page evaluation twice. The executive summary stated, "My cognitive function was at or above average for my age group, with zero evidence of decline in executive function, sustained attention, working memory, or judgment." She set the report down. "You did this 6 weeks ago." I explained to her that the scariest part of discovering fraud isn't the money. It's the creeping self-doubt underneath. The fear that maybe I'd missed 16 months of evidence because something was wrong with my own judgment. I was 61. Everything I built depended on my ability to evaluate what I was looking at. Before I could trust any decision I made during the investigation, I needed an objective answer. That report was meant for my eyes only. It was never intended for a courtroom. That it served both purposes now was purely accidental. Marsh tapped her pen against the table. The 5 incidents cited in this petition. I can already account for 3 of them using our civil case discovery logs. She stated it as an established fact. Someone had spent months carefully orchestrating these scenarios one by one. "I think I know who was watching from the inside," I said, leaving it at that. She looked at me for a moment. "We'll talk about that when you're ready." I drove through the early September streets. The hearing was 2 weeks away. Weil's evaluation was in Marsh's hands, and the civil records could dismantle 3 of the 5 claims. The remaining 2 needed a different approach, and I had a very specific plan for them. I needed to talk to someone who'd been working in my kitchen operations for 14 years. Someone close enough to the daily grind to spot details that never reach the executive suites. I'd known him since our 2nd year in business. Cruising through traffic on the way home, I couldn't figure out why it had taken me until this week to simply ask him what he'd seen, when he'd seen it, and if anything had felt off at the time. A courtroom on Monday morning carries a distinct quiet before it fills up. The smell of old paper, neutral carpeting, and overhead lighting that flatters no one, illuminating everything below with an unforgiving clarity. It's a space built to strip away the noise of an argument and reduce it strictly to evidence a judge can measure. Marsh and I arrived at 8:40 and took our seats in the gallery. Marcus and Diane were at the petitioner's table alongside Philip Greer. Greer was a stocky man near 50, wearing a suit that looked considerably more expensive than his legal arguments. He was the type of lawyer who relied on pure confidence when his case was thin. Diane sat next to Marcus, sharply dressed, watching the bench with an air of practiced composure, as if she'd played this game before and already knew how it would end. 2 seats to my left in the gallery, sitting silently, was Claire. She had arrived before me, wrapped in her coat, hands folded in her lap. She didn't look my way when I sat down, and I didn't speak to her. There are certain lines you don't cross in a courtroom right before the next 19 minutes. Do what ordinary conversation couldn't. Greer presented his case. He framed my return trip from Indianapolis as an elderly business owner wandering home at 2 in the morning in a state of confusion. He brought up the signed the signed neighbor's statement, and ran through the 5 incidents summary, offering a brief, dramatic takeaway for each. His main argument was that a 61-year-old sole owner posed an unquantifiable risk to the company's finances and employees without joint oversight. In 11 minutes, he managed to use the word confusion 3 times. Marsh stood up and delivered our defense with the kind of sharp efficiency that comes from 25 years of practice, targeting the exact weaknesses needed to collapse an already flimsy case. She submitted Dr. Wiles' evaluation, noted my 26 years of an active professional license with 0 complaints, presented records showing no operational errors over the previous 6 months, and added a letter from my physician confirming good health. Then, using discovery documents, she systematically dismantled all 5 cited incidents, one by one. Finally, she brought up the night in Indianapolis. On the night cited in this petition, Mr. Mercer correctly identified 2 unauthorized individuals on his property. His security system properly alerted emergency services, and he then made a deliberate, calm decision on how to handle the situation. That is not the behavior of an impaired individual. In fact, it is the exact opposite. Judge Holden, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses hanging from a lanyard, gave off the impression that she remembered every file that had ever crossed her desk. She flipped through Dr. Wiles' evaluation without saying a word. She noted for the record that the petition lacked any supporting medical documentation from a physician, and that every cited incident had been countered with documented explanations from the defense. She spent about 90 seconds reviewing the file. Then she dismissed the petition. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, grabbed my folder, and walked down the center aisle toward the exit. Marcus was standing in the aisle, and his position was no accident. The look on his face was that of a man who had just realized a machine he thought was broken was actually fully operational. It wasn't pure shock. It was the face of someone recalculating his position in real time. In those 3 seconds, I saw a man who thought he was 2 steps ahead suddenly realize he'd missed a step entirely. His posture didn't change, but his eyes did. I paused next to him. "You spent 3 months setting that trap," I said quietly, just low enough for him to hear. "It took me 6 weeks to tear it down." I walked out without looking back. Marsh and I walked toward the parking garage. She mentioned her investigator had started looking into those 5 incidents weeks before the hearing. 3 weeks ago, my contact received an unsolicited phone call. It was an employee from Mercer Catering who recognized our firm's name from a filing and called our office directly. An executive chef named Eddie Karam. He'd kept contemporaneous notes on every single one of those occurrences. He documented everything he saw from his station in the kitchen over those months. Things look very different from the kitchen floor than they do from an executive office. He was just waiting, Marsh said. He held on to those records until he found someone with the authority to receive them. I stopped in my tracks. Marsh had just said Eddie Karam's name. 14 years. Over the last 3 months, I'd walked through Eddie's kitchen hundreds of times, asking about prep counts and vendor deliveries, and not once, during any of those walkthroughs, did I think to ask, what is this man seeing from where he stands? He had been watching the exact same company from a completely different angle, keeping records I didn't even know to ask for, and finding his own way to tee them to the right hands without any prompting. I had assumed I was fighting this battle largely on my own. I was wrong. I stood in that parking garage and let that realization sink in. I drove over to the catering facility, not because of any scheduled appointment, but because a conversation that should have happened 3 months ago was long overdue. And the man who had been patiently observing, documenting, and keeping quiet was waiting. I parked a block west of the Callaway Avenue location, thinking about how many times I'd walked through that kitchen without ever considering what it looked like from the other side. Over 20 years. Today, I was going in to listen. The kitchen at the flagship location had a distinct feel after the lunch rush. The urgency drained away, equipment cooling down, counters wiped clean, and staff settling in at the back tables. When I pushed open the doors, Eddie Karam was at the pass, reviewing next week's prep schedules. He looked up and recognized me, something unspoken in his eyes, a look that said he'd been waiting for this exact moment. He set his clipboard down without a word. I pointed toward the dry store-out hallway, and he nodded, leading the way. The hallway ran along the north side of the kitchen, narrow, lit by a single overhead bulb, lined floor to ceiling, with shelves of labeled dry goods. It was quiet at that hour. Eddie leaned back against a rack, and I stood opposite him. He laid out what he'd been tracking. 4 months of observations, operational red flags that showed a subtle, deliberate pattern. Having worked in my kitchen for 14 years, I knew how his mind worked. He carefully separated what he saw from the conclusions he drew, keeping those boundaries clear the entire time. He detailed 3 specific events. First, a supply order I placed arrived with incorrect specs. Eddie checked the original requisition and found the details had been altered after submission, but before reaching the vendor. He kept a copy of my original version in his private binder. Second, a staff meeting I was supposed to lead was rescheduled by Marcus without informing me. Eddie kept the original calendar entry showing my name as the host, which Marcus had swapped out on the shared system. Third, a vendor agreement with flawed terms. Eddie had seen the draft 2 days before I signed it, and when the executed copy came back through kitchen procurement, he caught the discrepancies. He kept both versions. I didn't know what I was looking at, Eddie said. I just knew it was intentional, like someone assembling a framework piece by piece in spaces where they knew no one was looking at the whole picture. I was close enough to see each piece fall into place, but not high enough to see what they were building. Why didn't you come to me? I asked. He fell silent for a moment. There were 3 separate times I almost did, but all I had was a gut feeling that your son-in-law was manipulating systems he had legitimate access to. That's not something you bring to an owner unless you're absolutely certain. I wasn't sure if I was just being paranoid. So I kept the paper trail and waited until someone with real authority to act on it came along. Your lawyer's firm was that sign. I asked how he'd tracked down the firm. He said a legal notice had popped up in a county filing index he monitored for vendor contracts. The civil complaint had a case number attached. He looked it up, identified the lead attorney, and called her office directly. Then he paused. That specific kind of pause is when a person is weighing whether the timing is right to share one more thing. Your daughter called me, he said. About 2 weeks before the guardianship hearing, she noticed things at home. Small things, situations where her memory of an event didn't match how Marcus described it, to the point where she started doubting her own mind. She told me she was struggling to trust her memory. She couldn't put a name to what was happening. Another pause. I told her, write everything down and date it. Pay attention to things that feel orchestrated rather than like accidental mistakes. If she could verify anything using records that didn't depend on her memory, she needed to do that. I stood in that narrow hallway, taking it all in silently. Claire had reached to Eddie instead of me, for the same reason Eddie had hesitated to come to me. She wasn't certain either. She'd been enduring something she couldn't label, quietly and systematically pushed to second-guess her own reality. When she finally looked for someone to talk to, she found the right person. She just hadn't found her way to her father yet. I thought back to the courtroom that morning. 2 seats to my left, wrapped in her coat with her hands in her lap. She hadn't greeted me, and I hadn't spoken to her. I'd interpreted it as a respectful silence, that she was there to observe, not disrupt. Now, I saw it differently. There was so much she wasn't sure of, and facing such calculated moves, she didn't have a solid footing yet to reach out to a father she wasn't sure how to approach. I thanked Eddie and shook his hand. He said no thanks were necessary. He needed to get back to prep before the dinner service. That was Eddie, steady and practical as always. I left through the kitchen side door. I sat in my car on Callaway Avenue with the engine off. Claire had been navigating this completely alone. Her own doubts, her own attempts to keep records, with no one validating what she saw or confirming her instincts. She had reached out to the right person, but she hadn't reached out to me yet. I pulled out my phone. Her name was right there in my contacts, just as it had always been. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't press call. Not yet. I needed to understand what she'd actually documented, whether she was safe, and if the man living under her roof had any reason to view her as a threat. I expected to hear from Marsh before the end of the day, though it happened even sooner than I anticipated. Marsh called at 7:40 Thursday morning. Something just came in that you need to hear in person. Can you be here by 9? I was already dressed. I told her I'd be there. In her conference room, she waited until I had a cup of coffee in my hand before breaking the news. 2 days earlier, Claire had walked into the law firm alone. She'd found the firm through my public filings using the same county index Eddie Karam had used. She hadn't called ahead. She simply sat in reception for 40 minutes until Marsh had an opening. When she was brought in, she handed over a single item, a 31-minute audio file recorded on her phone, transferring it before saying another word. Here's how it happened. Claire had been working in the home office she shared with Marcus, using the desk, while her phone sat charging on a side table with the voice memo app running. She'd started the recording for a personal project and forgot to turn it off when she stepped out of the room. Marcus and Diane walked in right after, unaware she'd been there and assuming the room was empty. By the time Claire returned to grab her phone, the app had recorded 31 minutes of conversation. She listened to the recording alone in her car at the end of the driveway. She didn't call anyone for 2 days. Then she came straight to Marsh. Marsh was direct. The recording was incidental, which makes a huge difference for evidentiary admissibility. I won't sugarcoat it. Claire wasn't sent during the conversation, which puts us in tricky territory regarding consent laws under Indiana state law. We'll need to handle those arguments carefully in court. However, the contents of this file can be independently corroborated by everything you've gathered through the civil case, the audit, and Nora Phelps's statement. The recording gives us the roadmap. Our existing evidence gives us the standing. She slid a printed transcript across the table. I sat there and read through it. Marcus and Diane were discussing operational logistics. The timeline for contacting the neighbor, staging 2 operational failures ahead of the civil petition, and coordinating withdrawals from the LLC account. In their own words, they confirmed everything. Hale's audit and Dobbs's investigation had pieced together from the outside. Then, near the middle of the transcript, came a statement from Diane. Once the conservatorship goes through, the business center lease is the first liquid asset. The Hawthorne location gets transferred in Q1. I read that sentence twice, then flipped forward 4 pages. Senior staff are liabilities. You need to clear them out within the first 90 days. Start with the kitchen. I laid the paper flat on the table. I knew exactly what the kitchen meant. It meant Eddie Karam. It meant Nora Phelps. It meant 3 other people who had been with the company longer than Marcus Wayne had been on the payroll. I sat there in silence. Marsh watched me as I read. When I finally set the transcript down, she said, "She came in on her own. She didn't tell you she was doing it." It wasn't a question. "No," I said. "She didn't." I drove home. In my study, I read through the transcript a second time. Not for new information, since I'd already absorbed the details, but as a document Claire had sat with for 2 full days before deciding what to do with it. And then she had quietly taken action without asking me, just as Eddie Karam had spent 4 months quietly documenting what he saw without asking me either. In my closest circle, people had been meticulously watching out for me in ways I never even realized. I was still coming to terms with that. I sat at my desk for a moment, then picked up the phone. Claire answered on the 4th ring. I said her name, just her name. There was a pause on the line, slightly longer than usual. "Hi, Dad," she said. I told her I'd read what she brought to Marsh's office, and I thanked her. Then, before saying anything else, I asked her one simple question, calmly and without pressure. Did she remember telling Marcus about December 16th, the night he and Margaret opened their first restaurant? The pause on the line lasted even longer this time. "I remember," she said softly. "About 3 years ago." He asked about anniversaries, meaningful dates. I told him the story about that night, the paper cups, and what Mom said when you opened the doors. "I didn't think. You didn't do anything wrong," I told her. "Not a thing." Silence settled over both ends of the line. 3 years ago. The timing matched perfectly. It placed that moment squarely within the window. It placed that moment squarely other clues pointed to. It answered the very last open question, cleanly, and without any need for further doubt. "Thank you," I said. "I know," Claire replied. After that, we stayed on the phone for a while without saying much. Easy. It was that kind of silence that happens when the major things have been spoken, and whatever comes next demands more time and space than the rest of the evening can offer. Something shifted between us that night. Something that had been missing so long, we hadn't fully registered its absence until we recognized its return. When I went to bed, the transcript was still sitting on my desk. I didn't lock the study. I thought about what Marsh had said. The recording gave us direction, and the evidence we built gave us the case. I didn't need direction anymore. I knew exactly where this was headed. I just needed to bring everything into the right room, in the right order, and hand it to the person standing in the right position to receive it. That part of the work was almost ready. On a Friday morning, I drove to the Financial Crimes Division with a file box in my back seat. I felt that specific kind of clarity that arrives when all the preparation is finished, and the next step belongs to someone else. Detective Sandra Nolan's office was on the second floor, a functional, no-frills space, where every object had a clear purpose. She was in her late 40s, sharp, direct, and the kind of investigator who took notes and asked questions in a precise, logical sequence. She had me sit opposite her desk and told me to take my time. I presented the materials one by one, explaining each as I laid it down. Victor Hale's complete audit report, his methodology, and the whiteboard breakdown, showing 19 forged authorizations over 16 months, totaling $284,000, paired with travel documentation, placing me in other cities on the exact dates. Those signatures were allegedly written in person. Ray Dobbs' full investigative packet. G. Detailing the LLC history, LinkedIn timelines, Diane Rousseau's professional background and departure from her firm, alongside account activity and wire records. The 31-minute recording from Claire's phone with Marsh's printed transcript and an attached memo on admissibility considerations. And Helen Marsh's legal summary outlining the applicable Indiana statutes on fraud and forgery. I talked for about 25 minutes. Nolan didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she asked 5 targeted questions. Prior to the most recent transfer, what was the balance in the LLC account while under observation? $47,200, I replied. Ray Dobbs has been tracking it, and the destination of the recent transfer is being traced. Are the travel records complete for every single forged signature date? Hotel receipts, client meeting logs, and travel itineraries. I said, every single instance in the audit is backed by documentation, proving I was out of Caldwell. She looked over the transcript of the recording. The laptop password. The source is noted here. Detective. That was my own deduction, not something established by the recording itself, I clarified. My daughter mentioned that date to her husband in passing about 3 years ago, and she confirmed that conversation with me earlier this week. I've included her written statement in the folder. The recording confirms the context in which the password was used, but not how it was acquired. I want to be entirely clear on that distinction. Nolan made a quick note. The employee who documented those orchestrated incidents, is he cooperating? Yes. He's been with the company for 14 years. 3 weeks before the guardianship hearing, he reached out to my lawyer's investigator on his own initiative and called the firm directly. His contemporaneous notes are in the second folder. Wayne's access to the financial systems. Has that been revoked? My attorney processed the termination of access last week. He currently holds 0 system privileges at any level. Before standing up, I added one final detail. I'll also be filing amended tax returns for the fiscal years impacted by the fraudulent invoices. Those invoices passed through the books as legitimate vendor expenses. Regardless of how the investigation unfolds, I intend to correct our filings on my end. Nolan wrote that down without comment, then looked up. The bookkeeper. She's had independent counsel since last month. We'll reach out through her attorney. She set her pen down. Mr. Mercer, this is the most organized evidence package I've received in years. Give me 72 hours. I was an appraiser, I said. Documentation is my job. A faint trace of a smile almost crossed her face. I carried the empty box back to my car and drove through Caldwell, taking a route that passed our flagship on Callaway Avenue, then the second location on the north side of the business district, and finally the 2 locations out west, 5 locations built over 26 years. Every single one of them had started with a conversation about what a space could become, what it needed, what already existed beneath the surface damage, and what potential the structure held if handled correctly. I had spent my entire career having variations of that exact conversation. I knew how to recognize something worth restoring. I pulled into the driveway on Richmont Drive, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment. Everything I had gathered over 5 months was now sitting in a room at the Financial Crimes Division. The audit, Dobbs's findings, Claire's recording, and Nolan's box. The wheel that started turning the morning I returned from Indianapolis, standing in a dark hallway at 3 a.m. with my keys in my hand, had finally come full circle. I had been the one driving it forward. I organized it, documented it, and protected it from anything that could have derailed it along the way. Now, my job was to wait. It was the right next move, to wait without mistaking waiting for inaction, trusting that if something is built with enough care, it can carry the weight of whatever comes next. That evening in the workshop, I sanded the surface of the sideboard using long, even strokes along the direction of the grain. Compared to the condition it was in when I hauled it off a stranger's lawn back in August, the wood had transformed completely. Most of the layers obscuring it were gone, revealing what I'd suspected that first afternoon. A sound, solid structure truly worth the effort. At 8:47, my phone rang from a number I'd saved 3 weeks prior, Detective Sandra Nolan's direct line. I set the sandpaper on the workbench and picked up. Detective Nolan shared 3 updates on that brief call. A formal case had been opened. Marcus Wayne was being contacted for a voluntary interview. And that afternoon, a judge had granted a freeze on the Rousseau Culinary Partners account. I thanked her, placed the phone back on the bench, and sat on my stool in silence. From the dark hallway on Richmont Drive to the asset freeze on the Callaway Avenue account, it had taken 5 months. Before taking action, I needed to understand what I was truly dealing with, and gaining that clarity took the exact time it required. On Monday, I went into the office just as I had every Monday for 26 years. When I arrived, the light in Marcus's office was on. That distinct brightness of a man maintaining a performance that was no longer necessary, simply because he hadn't received formal notice. To stop, I worked through the morning. By Wednesday, when I arrived, his side of the building was dark, and it stayed dark. I noted it and kept working. Marsh called midweek. Marcus had gone in for a voluntary interview with his attorney on Wednesday morning. He didn't exercise his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. He talked. Whatever narrative he offered was now on the record, stacked directly against a massive evidence package he hadn't known existed until that very moment. I thought about the reality of his situation, freely attempting to justify himself without understanding the ground he was standing on. His confidence had been built entirely on the assumption that I hadn't spent 5 months gathering proof. Nolan's team is building additional charges, Marsh told me. What Marcus did to Nora Phelps constitutes criminal extortion. Her attorney has been fully cooperative since the deal was struck. The immunity arrangement is finalized. I thought back to Nora arriving 12 minutes early back in August, setting a bag she'd never opened inside the back door. She had come to confess, and she left with protection. That had always been the right outcome. She'd carried a burden for 11 months that was never hers to carry. Stepping forward the moment she felt confident someone could properly receive what she had to say. Marsh also noted that the civil court had formally stayed our civil suit, pending the outcome of the criminal case. Standard procedure. Once the criminal matter concluded, our initial claims would be addressed through criminal restitution orders. The civil track had accomplished its purpose. It applied pressure to the timeline, put the fraud on the record, and forced a reaction that exposed what Marcus and Diane had prepared in advance. Now, the criminal process would carry it to the finish line. The following Monday, Marsh called again. Before I tell you this, I need you to sit down. I was already sitting on my workshop stool. Diane Rousseau's attorney reached out to the district attorney's office yesterday, Marsh said. She offered complete internal records for Rousseau Culinary Partners, LLC filings, transaction histories, and all communications in exchange for full transactional immunity. She paused. The DA turned her down. Marsh explained the reasoning, just as it had been delivered to Diane's attorney. The DA's office already possessed Hale's full audit, Dobbs's report, the LLC documents obtained through discovery, Claire's recording with the complete transcript, and 11 months of detailed internal records provided through Nora Phelps's cooperation. Diane Rousseau had nothing left to trade. She's not a key witness who can crack the case open, Marsh said. She's a co-defendant trying to buy a way out. They thanked her attorney and declined. Marsh added another detail. The Indiana Supreme Court Disciplinary Commission has been notified. Regardless of the criminal outcome, she's facing separate disciplinary proceedings. Her career in law is over. I remembered that night in the study when Diane stepped out from behind Marcus. Her face hadn't gone pale. It was completely unreadable, actively running calculations. She had been the coolest presence in the room, reading every variable in real time. The most dangerous person present. But when it mattered most, she hadn't been quite as clever as she thought. Dobbs sent his final update later that week. Before the freeze fully took effect, the LLC account had been drawn down from $47,200 to just $3,100. In the brief window between the case opening and the freeze taking effect, someone had been draining the funds. The frozen balance stood at $3,100, while the rest was being traced by financial investigators from the DA's office. His report was complete, and Dobbs considered his assignment finished. I paid his final invoice that afternoon, adding a handwritten note at the bottom of the confirmation. Thank you for your thoroughness. It held up at every critical turn. I didn't know if Dobbs read personal notes on payment receipts, but I wrote it anyway. I reflected on everything I'd asked of everyone involved over the past 5 months, and the one person who, without being asked, used her own judgment to bring forward the exact thing we needed most at the perfect time. Marsh called on a Thursday afternoon. Her voice carried that familiar tone she used whenever a decisive ruling came down in a room I wasn't in. "Formal charges have been filed," she said. A brief pause. "Both of them?" I asked. "Both of them." I placed the phone on the workbench and looked down at the surface of the sideboard. The first coat of finish had been curing for a week. The final stage required a deliberate pause, less about patience and more about understanding what that time allows. Everything else had been built toward this moment. The final steps you take on a piece determine how long it lasts. I've known that for as long as I've done this work, and that night I understood it better than ever. The business center at 7 in the evening has a distinct feel I'd never given much thought to before. The HVAC system winding down, the elevator moving infrequently, and the common area lights running at half power. Over 26 years, I'd worked late there countless times, reviewing contracts, working through quarterly plans, handling the quiet paperwork that only gets done after the phones stop ringing. But the building had never felt this quiet. It carried a specific weight now. Marcus's office was dark, as it had been for weeks, and without him there, the space returned to the building I'd always known. Nolan called while I was at my desk, reviewing the restructuring documents Marsh had sent over that afternoon. She used the same precise, efficient tone from our first meeting. No extra warmth, just straight facts. "I need to apprise you of what the legal review uncovered," she said. She laid it out clearly. Through October and November, another $91,000 in unauthorized transfers had taken place. This happened after the civil summons was served, after the guardianship hearing, out into the rain, and after his voluntary interview with her department. Well, after Marcus Wayne was fully aware an active investigation was underway. "This is no longer just a historical case," Nolan said. Knowing we were actively investigating criminal conduct and fully aware of ongoing legal proceedings, he continued anyway. "The charges are being amended accordingly." "He just kept going," I said. "Yes," she replied, pausing briefly. "The severity has escalated significantly." After hanging up, I sat there, processing the news. Marcus had kept going, after receiving the summons, after the guardianship attempt failed, and after a voluntary interview where he made statements directly contradicting a massive paper trail he didn't know existed. Either he believed there was still an open exit, or those $580,000 in gambling debts left him with no choice but to keep pushing forward. Maybe both. That's the logic of a man who's already gone over the edge, still reaching for something on the wall to break his fall, simply because stopping means facing the impact. At 3 o'clock the next afternoon, I met with Marsh in her office. 2 documents were laid out on her conference table, and she skipped the small talk. "This is no longer primarily about the criminal case. Marcus is finished on that front. This is about those casino creditors. The parties holding his Las Vegas debts can pursue civil remedies. If they seek a civil judgment and attempt to levy against business interests they claim were co-managed by Marcus. We need to make sure our ownership structure is crystal clear and fully protected before that process begins." She tapped the signature line on the first document. "Sign here." The restructuring converted Mercer Catering into Mercer Hospitality Holdings LLC, a new entity with asset protection provisions that left zero room for interpretation by creditor attorneys. She placed the second document beside it. "And this one dissolves the former operating entity, where Marcus claimed co-manager status, cleanly severing any interest he might claim to represent." I signed both documents at 20 minutes to 4. Marsh witnessed them, and her assistant notarized the signatures. 26 years had passed since I first registered that business name on a folding table behind the flagship, while contractors built out the bar, and Margaret counted chairs, telling me the seating layout blocked the sightlines. She was right about that, just as she was right about most important things in those early years. That original name was never meant to outlast her. Yuye. It could only endure in a different form, structured to reflect what had actually been built, stripping away any ambiguity that allowed someone to stand beside it and claim a piece of it for themselves. Marsh closed the folder. Formal charges are fully filed, arraignment is complete, and plea negotiations began this week. If both defendants accept the terms, the DA expects sentencing in February. She paused. They have zero leverage. No, I said, they don't. That night, in the study, I pulled open the top right drawer of my desk. The same drawer that had been accessed without authorization at some point over the past year. It was the one small piece of privacy in the house, exploited while I was away by someone who had easy access. Now, it contained only what I chose to put there: a small notebook, a spare pen, and the key to the workshop. I looked at it for a moment, then slid it shut. Marsh's final email arrived at 9:53 p.m. Claire had formally submitted a request to attend the sentencing hearing as a family member. Not as a witness, and with no legal role, but simply to be present in the room. I read through it, closed my laptop, and sat in the quiet study. I pictured who would be in that courtroom come February, which side of the room everyone would occupy, and what the air would feel like when it was over. For 6 months I had focused on reaching a specific outcome. Now, that outcome rested in the hands of a sentencing judge, right where it belonged. I'd known that since the morning I stood in the dark hallway at 3 a.m., realizing for the first time what I was truly facing. At 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in February, Judge Patricia Holden entered the courtroom. She carried the calm authority of someone who had presided over countless similar rooms and had stopped being surprised by human nature years ago. Everyone stood, then sat. Claire sat 2 seats to my right. About 30 seconds before the session began, she had briefly stepped out, returning just as the judge organized the files on her bench. She looked straight ahead, and so did I. We didn't say a word. Marcus sat at the defense table in a dark suit that looked recently purchased, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. At one point during the preliminary remarks, his gaze drifted toward the gallery, an involuntary glance, and he caught my eye before quickly looking away. He didn't look back again. Diane sat at the same table, positioned slightly apart from him. She sat upright, her face completely neutral, a blank expression I had learned to recognize. It wasn't composure, it was control. She had been managing her presentation since that night in my study, and she would keep managing it as long as there was any perceived utility in doing so. Judge Holden reviewed the plea agreements with methodical efficiency, ensuring each defendant understood and accepted the terms. Marcus said, "Yes, Your Honor," his voice flat, cautious, and barely audible. Diane's response carried the exact same measured tone she used for everything else. The sentences were entered into the record. For Marcus, 5 years of probation with mandatory monthly reporting and community service. Full restitution of $375. Zuzen payable over 24 months starting in 30 days, and a permanent ban from holding an executive or managerial role in any commercial entity. For Diane, 18 months of home detention, a $65,000 fine payable within 90 days, and a complete referral of her file to the state bar for formal disciplinary proceedings. As Marsh had anticipated, that referral effectively marked the end of her legal career. The court clerk stamped the judgment. I briefly thought about the restitution structure. The asset liquidation plan Marsh had coordinated with court officials, now binding his accounts, vehicles, and personal property. The money would be returned. The court would see to that. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, gathered my folder, and walked out without looking back at Marcus once. What? Claire walked with me down the courthouse hallway. Out on the cold February sidewalk, a coffee cart was set up. We bought 2 cups and stood together for a moment in silence. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm okay," I said, adding more accurately, "I will be." She held her cup in both hands. "I should have told you earlier about what I was seeing at home." "You spoke up when it mattered most," I said. A brief pause followed. "I'm the one who told him about that date, Dad." The password was 1612, I noted gently. "You were just telling your husband a story about his father-in-law's first restaurant," I said. "You don't owe me an apology for that." She looked at me for a long moment, then gave a quiet nod. We stood there together until both our coffees had gone cold. My mind drifted to Margaret, remembering a day years ago when she and I had come to this same courthouse for some routine errand. I couldn't even recall what for anymore. I just remembered the day itself, the light on the stone steps, and the way she held her coat collar tight against the cold. In March, the first restitution payment arrived on a Tuesday morning. $15,625. I checked the account over my first cup of coffee, noted the entry, set my phone down, and looked out at the back garden. The tree was still bare. March always feels like warmth will never return, right up until the moment it does. In April, a plain envelope arrived in the mail with no return address. I recognized the handwriting before I even picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 words and no signature. "I'm sorry," I read it twice, folded it along its original creases, and placed it in the top right drawer of my desk. I left the drawer unlocked. Claire came over that evening, bringing a home-cooked meal, something she hadn't done in years. We ate at the kitchen table, and at some point, the conversation drifted away from everything that had happened and turned back to older times. "Do you still have that number 4 plane?" she asked. "The one with the split handle?" "I fixed the handle," I said. "When? A few years ago. Maybe longer." She looked at me. "Can I see the sideboard?" We walked out to the workshop, and I turned on the overhead light. She ran her hand over the surface just as I had done, slowly following the grain. "It's beautiful, Dad." I paused before answering. "It took a long time." "I know," Claire said softly. "I was watching you work the whole time." She didn't clarify whether she meant the sideboard or everything else, and I didn't ask. I found myself explaining the tools hanging on the pegboard just like I used to when she was a little girl, handing them to me upside down. She listened just as she had back then. After she left, I returned to the workshop. The mahogany sideboard stood finished on the workbench. 3 months had passed since the first coat of oil. I ran my hand over the wood, smooth, even, with the deep grain showing clearly through the amber and walnut tones. The split in the foot was secured. The loose veneer was flush, and the surface caught the light evenly from every angle. It took the exact time it needed. Not a single day was wasted. I turned off the work light and walked back through the kitchen. The desk drawer in the study was closed, but unlocked. Outside, April was doing what it always does, bringing the first subtle traces of green to the tips of the branches went, the kind you only spot if you stop and look closely. I stopped, I looked, and then I went inside. There's still work ahead, but it's a different kind of work, starting from a very different place than where I began. Looking back at everything between that June night on Richmont Drive and this April morning, watching the first green buds appear on bare branches, I learned something 61 years hadn't yet taught me. The truth doesn't need your anger. It just needs your patience. I believe God doesn't build straight paths, but if you're willing to carefully observe the ground beneath your feet, He will lay down a road strong enough to carry you through. And if there's one thing I want to tell you directly, it's this: don't be like me. Don't wait until everything is broken before you ask the people closest to you what they've actually been seeing all along. Eddie watched that kitchen for 4 months. I walked right past him hundreds of times and never thought to ask a single question. And the cost was so much more than just money. This is an old man's story. I'm guessing a lot of you watching have probably lived through your own version of it. Maybe there weren't forged invoices, but rather that quiet, creeping realization that the people you trusted most were the ones you examined the least. Family justice isn't about revenge. It's about meeting your obligations to the truth, to the people who depend on you, and to yourself. Every story like this holds lessons you'll never learn in a classroom. Sometimes real accountability looks like 6 months of patient silence, a file box in the back seat of a car, and a cold cup of coffee on a sidewalk in February. And that is more than enough. That's my story, and that's what real family justice looks like in every way that matters. If any part of this resonated with you, drop a comment down below. Share it today with someone who might need to hear it, and if you want a sticker, hiss them to see where things go from here. You know where the subscribe button is. Thank you for watching. Subscribe button is. For watching all the way to the end. Moving forward, I'll be sharing more stories crafted with creative elements built purely for reflection and meaningful storytelling. If that's not your thing, no worries at all. Feel free to find what works for you. But if you're staying, there is still so much more worth sitting with.